Hi, everybody. So as Jatine said, I'm Nigel Moore. I work at WISE. And for the last 2 years, since we've had this program, I've been managing it on a day-to-day basis. What I want to do today is essentially to address the first question that we have for this panel, which is innovation the problem? And to present you with some ideas around opportunities for innovation that we see looking at the problem of energy access, particularly in the developing world. I also want to talk about a few things that may be of interest in some of the recent work that we've done, and try to tie them into this question about innovation and our role and what role a university and a consortium of researchers can play in this very complex problem that involves a whole lot of other stakeholders. So I'm going to start sort of broad and get a little bit more specific and try to tie it together around that innovation narrative. So this is something that Jatine often shows, and he does a better job of making it matter than I do. But if you look at this map, this is the world at night. You can't see it particularly well here, but you see sort of the areas of darkness and light, right? So this is sort of a really quick snapshot of, where is there electricity and where isn't there. And I think what's striking to me about this is that there's about twice as many people in Africa as there are in Europe, and look at the disparity, right? But that sort of paints a picture of inequality and sort of a sad story. But the truth is that we are on the verge of a major global opportunity, as the falling costs of clean technologies are resulting in the uptake of small solar systems across the world, even in some of the most impoverished areas of sub-Saharan Africa, developing Asia, and Latin America. And the opportunity here is really for the delivery of these systems to provide a foundation for meeting a slew of other objectives embodied by the SDGs. However, this is not a given, right? You don't necessarily provide electrons and get out a better way of life. In order for the promise of affordable and clean energy to be realized across the world, we need to understand the socio-technical systems and the innovations that must be in place to leverage its impact and create social value, create value that helps people to live a better life. In exploring this sort of concept of social value, earlier this year, we wrote a paper with some folks at Arizona State University at the Grassroots Energy Innovation Lab, trying to unpack this connection between access to energy and quality of life improvement, and we sort of laid out a number of different posited a few different things that we sort of found to be the case. The first one being that access to energy has social value, which means that the way in which energy is used by a community can contribute positively or negatively to community well-being. Number two, that what matters most is not electrons, but the energy service that's provided. So what does the energy do, and how does this align with socially desirable outcomes? Three, this delivery of energy service is accomplished by a socio-technical system. This is like social science sort of stuff, but the idea that a whole slew of different actors are involved in the delivery of this, and the way in which energy is delivered also determines whether there's reinvestment, local ownership, and these sort of things that can drive local economic development through access to energy as well. Underlying the ability of all of this is policy changes and regulatory structures that allow innovations around the way that energy is delivered to take root. So what does this sort of socio-technical system look like? We tried to draw this map when we had a fellow from the University of Oxford visiting us here of the global energy access sector. So we mapped out a whole bunch of different actors from, sort of our group here, the researchers, to the influencers, equipment suppliers, and you can sort of see the rest, and the flows of different things between them: equipment, money, data, expertise, and influence. And we think that looking at this sort of systems view can be a helpful way of teasing out the potential impact of innovations in the sector, right? So it can help deliver a theory of change. If you're a research group like ours and we're trying to say, what can we do within this space to drive down the cost of energy in certain places, or whatever it might be, we can look at this sort of map and see what sort of actors we would need to be working with and that sort of thing. We also realize when putting this together that at the systems level, we really need to look at people as vectors of change. So if we're going to, according to Sustainable Development Goal number 7, provide access to clean electricity for over 1 billion people, additional people, by 2030, we're going to need a huge influx of new entrepreneurial and innovative people to drive the success and growth of the overall sector and in these various actor groups. As a university, this is a great opportunity because we are in a position to help guide the next generation towards becoming leaders in this field. And this brings me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is a new program that we just unveiled in the last month or so, called Queen Elizabeth Scholars for Energy Access. And through this program, which we get funding from the Queen Elizabeth Scholars Program, which is Rideau Hall Foundation, Universities Canada, and Community Foundations Canada, we essentially are able to place University of Waterloo co-op students in social enterprises that work on energy access all over the world. I think this is a really excellent marriage of the strength of University of Waterloo, which in my view, one of our greatest strengths certainly is our students and the co-op program, and the fact that there's a real need for STEM competencies in the energy access sector, and that we have plenty of students who will be the STEM innovators of tomorrow. At AE4H, we've developed relationships with a number of different social enterprises that work from Ghana to Malaysia and all over the developing world. And so what we're doing here is sort of putting all those things together and providing these internship experiences for some of our students, and hopefully they go off and decide to make a career out of this. And ultimately, the goal, there's sort of 3 goals. One is to deliver eye-opening and career-building experiences in the energy access sector to our students. Another is to provide social enterprises in the sector with high-caliber student interns that can contribute to their mission. But then third is to create a community of these scholars that become the future innovators, advocates, and leaders of tomorrow in the energy access sector. And at a sort of higher level, what I'd really love to see is that by the end of this program in a few years, a number of the companies, the social enterprises that are going out there that have 50,000, 100,000 customers in sub-Saharan Africa that are hiring our students are companies that came from Waterloo. And if you look at some of the ones that we're working with here, many of these started as a student project or a thesis or this sort of thing, and usually it was at Berkeley or MIT, but the next wave should come from Waterloo, and I think that our students are very well positioned to do this, and I think that we have an opportunity to deliver on this program, but also to grow it even further, and personally I'd sort of love to see this expand beyond just energy and looking at sustainable development and social enterprise in a broader sense. So now what I want to do quickly, and I've got a bit of time, is get more to the specific stuff and talk about some interesting technology innovation opportunities that we've sort of uncovered through engaging with various people in the sector over the last couple of years. So I think the question that frames this is, what can a renewable energy system deployed in an economically depressed region do affordably? And so asking this question helps get us to the core of the innovation opportunity, which is how to couple access to that solar panel with a highly efficient end-use technology that actually delivers something of value that can contribute to local economic development, social value delivery, and that sort of thing. So it's not just about getting solar panels out there. Solar panel can't do anything for you, right? It's the solar panel linked to a water pumping device. It's a solar panel linked to a welding device. It's the solar panel at a refugee camp, or a solar panel that powers the projector at a school, or the microgrid that powers the greenhouse in Nunavut that's growing food. And it's the marriage of these sort of end uses that are really tied to what is desirable and needed within a community with the access to energy, where I think there's a lot of opportunity for innovation. To give a little bit more texture around this, this is a graph from a Lawrence Berkeley National Lab study. So the top bar graph you see there is a solar home, SHS's solar home system. From 2009, sort of high-tech 2009 solar system, home scale, small system, with standard appliances running it, and that's the cost of it. In 2014, 5 years later, you see the cost has reduced because the balance of system costs have gone down, the battery, the PV system have all become less expensive. However, in 2014, if you took those same level of technology, but had efficient appliances hooked in, you see the cost has reduced significantly. And that's because if you have your end-use appliances, what you need to power with this that much more efficient, you need a much smaller solar battery system to run it. And this is something that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, I think, in the field. There aren't a lot of appliance manufacturers that are looking at really super efficient, DC powered appliances for application in Africa and Asia, but it's a huge opportunity to lower the cost and provide better service in these markets. The next thing is that when you think about coupling the appliance itself with the system, which is what a lot of small enterprises are doing now. They don't just sell the battery and small solar system. They also sell a television, some lights, a fan, that sort of thing. You can also think of those as those appliances as potentially generating income for the person themselves. So irrigation pumps for farmers, fridges for cold beverage sales, hair clippers for barbers, TVs for local cinemas. These are opportunities to lower to drive the curve even further back. So you think about that small investment in a small solar panel and battery setup or whatever it might be is able to power these super efficient devices that also generate income for you. And this is where the value proposition is getting really attractive, but we need a lot more innovation on those appliances so that we can move this needle even further. Luckily, there has been over the last 5 years, a little bit more attention being paid to this. So this is the Global Leap Awards. Every year they do a new competition on a different appliance. It's all about the off-grid sector. And so they've done them on light bulbs, they've done a television competition, radios, fans, and this year they did refrigeration. And so this is the last slide, and the last thing I sort of want to present is a few areas that I think really need more attention right now. So one is refrigeration. So refrigeration off-grid can provide income streams for small businesses and micro-enterprises. It can help health clinics store materials, improve nutrition, reduce the amount of people spend shopping for food, which is a big deal. And this particular one, the Sundancer that you see up here, that won this year's prize, Global Leap Prize for efficiency, can run on a single 45-watt solar module. It can be AC or DC, but it costs $700, right, which is too much. And the thing is, Sundancer is a tiny company, and they just designed this for this competition because they saw this, $500,000 prize. Am I out of time? 1 minute, okay. So we need more innovation on that. Two other things I want to point to really quickly is electric cooking. So there's been a lot of attention paid to improved cook stoves with so many people using biomass in their homes and the air pollution, indoor air pollution that results from that. There's been very little effort put into increasing the efficiency of electric cooking and try to marry that with the fact that we've got this increased penetration of solar home systems in regions where people tend to use biomass cooking. And the final one that I just want to throw out there is cooling is going to be a huge thing over the next 50 years. David talked a little bit about the number of heat days that we have here and how that's increasing. This is going to be a much bigger deal in places like India, where you've got tiny amount of penetration of AC right now, but it's going to jump in massive ways and erode any other efficiency gains we make. And so efficient cooling is a big area of innovation that we need that's sort of also about this end use sort of thing. So thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time, but those are a few of the opportunities for innovation that we see. Please feel free to say hi and send me an email if you want to talk some more about this sort of stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. We will keep questions to the end of the panel, so maybe I'll call upon Bisan now to make her remarks. Bisan, thank you.
Thanks, Jatin. So today I'll be talking to you about a current project that we're working on in the area of shared electricity. So I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the impact, the recent impact of the shared economy and what has it been doing on the current disruptive technologies that we're facing right now. So in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of increase in terms of the disruptive technologies, in terms of the disruptive services that we have been having, in particular for the energy sector, the transportation sector, as well as the housing sector. So for example, in terms of transportation, we have new models that have been arising, for example, with the rise of Uber, with the rise of Lyft, blah cars, and so on, and all of these car-sharing economy that has been impacting our daily lives, as well as changing our behavior from owning assets into going towards more sharing assets and utilizing deficiencies in other people's assets so that we can gain a bit more advantage. In terms of business models, what we are trying to do, or the shared economy, what it's trying to do is utilize or exploit the underutilized resources. And there has been a huge growth recently in the shared economy. So for example, in the US, it's estimated to increase to $40 billion up to the year of 2022. And globally or worldwide, this has been projected an increase up to $330 billion. So there's a huge opportunity there for the energy sector to tip into this sharing economy and gain some advantage on that. So what about the energy or the smart grid sector? So what types of products or services can be shared? Additionally, what type of technology and infrastructure or innovation is needed in order to support this sharing, as well as what are the business models that need to be taken care of so that they can support this type of sharing economy for the energy sector. So in terms of the current projects that I'm working on, or what I would like to point out in terms of the shared electricity services, is the first one, which I'll be discussing a bit more details in the next couple of slides, is the shared storage. So shared storage is several households which share common batteries, and that depended on their power consumption and their demand patterns. Other types of sharing electricity services can be in the sense of distributed generation. So DERs also can be shared. For example, if households install solar panels in their homes, or even businesses installing PVs, this can be really effective once they start this excess energy generation being shared among others. So this will reduce the costs, and it will increase the efficiency or the capacity of the grid. As well as there's another additional point that I would like to point out, which is sharing demand flexibility. And this means that currently throughout the day, there's some peaks in terms of the demands, right? So if customers are being more flexible, and if they can share this flexibility or have some incentives so that they can spread their load not according to a given time period, but across multiple time periods, this will create some flexibility in the demand, and this will include high efficiencies in terms of energy capacity, as well as would reduce the whole prices for the whole energy system. So in terms of the current project that I'm working on, and I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that particular project, is in terms of we have a given community. So David was talking about in the morning, we have a community. So we have some houses connected to some solar panels, as well as let's say they have some EVs as well. And we have the aggregator. Now, usually the energy production and consumption, they do not align together, right? And we want to bridge this supply and demand. And for bridging that, we can come up with a locally, like a better locally produced electricity or energy service. And for that, we will be talking about energy storage. So energy storage will allow us to have this bridge between the supply and the demand. And in some sense, what we need to come up with this energy storage system is a couple of things. So the first thing is we need like an optimal size and allocation of energy storage. So do we want to allocate each household one storage device? And if yes, what's the capacity? Do you want to share these storage devices among multiple houses? And then again, what is the size and the capacity of these energy storage devices? And once we have this allocation, or first step in terms of allocation, then we want to start optimizing the operation of these storage devices. And in terms of optimization there, what you want to do is try to find the best or the optimal allocation in terms of charging and discharging from which household to which storage device at which point in time. So the right household at the right point in time in the right place and the right form of energy. So again, if you think about like the developing world and remote communities, you don't want to install energy storage devices for each and every house. This will create some like space limitation. It will be a bit on a high investment cost. So what you would like to do is maybe instead share these like devices among different households based on some criteria that we will be talking about. So considering shared energy storage will have a significant impact in terms of reducing the investment costs if done properly, and it will also allow people to share this resource in a more efficient way. So what we're trying to do in this particular project is consider an integrated framework, and in this integrated framework, what we will do is like a 3 steps. So at the first phase, what we are trying now to do is understand the consumption patterns of some households, whether it is in a remote area or in a developing world. Right now, we're working with data from Ireland. So we're working energy consumption data from Ireland, in particular from the city of Dublin, and trying to understand the power consumption patterns of certain households. We have 5,000 households right now that we're working with. And once we understand the consumption pattern, we can start allocating storage and come up with some resource planning opportunities. After the phase 1 and allocating the storages to the households that we think that would fit together, the second point is now trying to understand the power consumption operations. And this I will be talking a bit about next, is how to schedule the power operations of each of the households given the set of devices that they have, and given, like, do they have a solar panel or not? Do they have an electric vehicle or not? And so on. Like, all of this, the first 2 steps that we're discussing, is all in a deterministic format. It means that we know exactly the devices that they have, we know exactly the power consumption that they are going to use, and we know exactly also the prices that are coming from the market and the supply as well of the electricity. So we are not exploiting any of uncertainty in this case. Like the third phase and the last phase, we will start exploring uncertainty. In particular, we will be looking at uncertainty in the demand loads. Of course, you can also consider pricing and supply uncertainty. However, that will overcomplicate things a bit further, and this is something we will be looking into definitely in the future. So let me spend a couple of minutes talking about the consumption analysis. So we have the power consumption that every 30 minutes. We have the 30 minutes power consumption of households in Dublin. And what we are trying to do is to cluster these households based on some features that are captured by their demand patterns and their profiles. So once we have these clustering, using the smart meter data set, what we can do is like cluster them, for example, into 4 or 5 clusters. Let's say we have economic customers, we have small family, we have big family, we have heavy consumers, and so on. Okay? And that size of the cluster or the number of clusters is something you can work around with depending on the intuition that you are getting from the data. So once you have these clusters and you know the communities or the households that have similar patterns, the second step will be to allocate the storage based on these patterns. You might want to allocate, like let's say for cluster 1, 2 or 3 storage devices based on the size of these clusters. Again, that depends on the size of the cluster and based on the capacity as well as the performance of the storage battery. Now, taking this allocation step and assigning storage devices to the household communities, also we are taking into account like the current cost of the energy prices. Of course, like we've considered different models. There is like the day and night energy prices, which is in Dublin right now, but also they're trying to move or to shift towards dynamic pricing, which means that the prices are changing throughout the day. At any given, like it's a half an hour again interval, and different hours will have different prices based on some forecasted energy prices that they have. So, like our main objective function in this case is, or main objective is to take into account minimizing the total cost in terms of energy, given the dynamic pricing scheme. And then we have some operational constraints that I don't want to emphasize on. I know it's a bit of too much math. So what I want you to get away from this slide is mostly like this part focuses on the devices of the households that they have. So, and the households devices are, we try to take into account a large, diverse number of devices. For example, we have uncontrollable devices, which means like the lighting and the fridge and so on and so forth. We have some devices that are coming from like the PV. So these are going to produce some energy. We have uninterruptible load like dishwashers, washing machines, and like dryers. We have deferrable loads, which means like electric vehicles. So these fall under this area. And we have thermal loads like ACs and heating systems. So we're trying to decide at which point in time we want to turn on or off these loads, and taking into account all of the pricing scheme, the total demand in terms of the energy, as well as I will be talking next, the storage capacity. So in addition to these devices, the houses have the opportunity to store energy in these shared batteries and to consume energy from these shared batteries, again, depending on their consumption and depending on the prices that are coming throughout the day. And these equations will model like which houses are charging which batteries, at which point in time, as well as what is the current state of the battery, given some efficiencies of that. Do I have 5 minutes? Okay. So I would like to wrap up with this integrated framework that we're proposing. Again, this is applicable right now. We're working with the data in Dublin, but it can be applicable to any like developing world community as well as remote area community. So the models are generic. There's nothing that restricts us from applying it to other data sets once we have the power consumption data from the other like countries. Here, like what we're considering, again, what I just mentioned to you is we are allocating shared resources, in this case, shared batteries, but you can also consider shared PVs as well, and shared electric vehicles or electric bikes. So in some sense, we can capture as well these in our model. We are trying to optimize the energy cost based on some operational constraints related to the devices, and we're trying to find the best allocation of this in our energy management system. These like two graphs shows like with shared energy storage versus without. So the first two are without energy storage, how each household is consuming, how much battery is being stored, and like who's storing at which point in time. While as here, once we have shared storage, you can see that multiple now houses are storing or charging and discharging the same battery, and this will reduce the whole power consumption and will reduce the costs of the whole system altogether without encountering or looking into the investment costs for this battery. Okay? So one final thing I would like to just briefly talk about, and it's very similar or an analogy of this type of work that we have done. So we worked on a similar thing for water networks where we have storage in terms of tanks, and we have there like power consumption in terms of the pumping, scheduling the pumping to be on and off at given points in time. And with this shared storage in terms of the tanks, we were able also to have a reduction in terms of the costs and the total consumption of electricity, taking into account the demand of the community in terms of water demand, as well as the isolation of leakages and water loss. And we were able to apply this to Cork City Centre, Cork Utility, which is funded by the Cork City Council. And we were able to get some percentage in terms of total cost savings just using the similar framework to the water networks. And with that, I think I will stop at this point. Thanks.
Thank you, Bisan. So this is mathematics trying to squeeze capital cost out, squeeze waste out, and it's all math that makes things incredibly affordable. We'll have more questions for Bisan later, but I think it's a wonderful illustration. Thank you, Bisan. Claudio is the next speaker. Claudio?
What I'm going to be talking about is some of the work we've been doing more recently on remote communities planning in particular. The past 10 years I've been involved in different aspects of microgrids, and particularly isolated microgrids. And some of the more recent work that we did for a company, which I think is relevant to this discussion of new technologies, is regarding the variable speed generator, diesel generator that they have developed. And what is the influence on penetration of renewable energy in remote communities. So this gives you a bit of an outline of what I'm going to be talking about, give you the motivation and objectives, describe that what started all this work, which is the WWF study that we did for WWF regarding this issue of how feasible it is and how much energy or renewable energy you can introduce in these communities based on the existing technologies, and particularly cost, because that's one of the main driving forces here, given the issue that they are limited in terms of capital cost and the cost of driving these existing microgrids. So I'll describe the study, which basically divided into two steps, the pre-feasibility and the feasibility. And the feasibility we did for this company, Novus, was basically look at what would be the impact of introducing this new type of generation. So I'll give you that, describe briefly the generator, this technology, and then basically the approach and the results of this, and some conclusions. Now, the motivation for our work is basically, in particular in this particular work, is basically the threat of environmental impacts in these Arctic communities of diesel generation. Why? Because there are 50 communities in the Canadian Arctic. We focus in the Canadian Arctic, but this applies to other Arctic regions in the world, which is basically diesel generation, basically based on diesel generation. They have electricity produced by these diesel machines. Now, emissions is basically a significant problem, but black soot is as well an issue, because basically that increases the melting rate of ice. So the idea, besides the storing and transporting diesel in all of these communities. And another major concern, besides the environmental issues, is the issue of costs. Bringing this diesel in itself is costly. It's getting more costly now that the price of oil is basically rising again. And one of the major problems is transporting and delivering that diesel to these regions, which are very remote. So that makes the cost of diesel fuel very, very significant in the running of these microgrids. And this is particularly for governments and communities is a significant challenge. Now, the idea would be to replace this diesel with renewable energy, green and solar in particular, and how much you can introduce in these communities. So that's basically what is driving the work. And this is the motivation of the work. It started with WISE, which I'm part of, at the University of Waterloo, basically collaborating or being part of a consortium with WWF Canada to basically try to introduce in the regions of Nunavut and Northwestern Territories renewable energy sources in these grids. There have been some pilot projects on minor minor, if you will, projects in which some of this has been tried or has been tested. However, nothing at the level that what we have seen in Alaska, in which there basically has been a major drive on introducing all these renewable energy, particularly wind, in all of these communities, remote communities, to move away from this. Now, the idea was, well, what this consortium is trying to accomplish is, well, can we do it in a significant scale? Get 5 communities, identify 5 communities, in 2 or 3 of them basically introduce measure significant amounts of renewable energy, and how much is feasible. Okay? And that's basically the driving, the objective of all of this work. We started with this particular study. Now, in the process, Innovus Power came with this variable speed generation, which, by the way, this variable speed generation has been now installed in one of the communities in Nunavut, I believe, very recently, just to demonstrate the technology and see that it actually is an alternative to other diesel generation. Okay? Because the advantage of this is that it has higher efficiencies and low load capabilities, which basically increases the range in which you can use these machines, which is a big advantage, as I'll show you, from the point of view of introducing or increasing the penetration of renewable energy. Okay? So what we did is perform a feasibility study of these 4 of the 6 Arctic communities that we identified in the feasibility report for the WWF. Now, what was the intention? As you can see here, you have the regions here of, we have basically Nunavut and Northwestern Territories. We were particularly focusing in this region over here, in which we were trying to look at the introduction of renewables, and in a particular region here, in this region here of Northwestern Territories. So we proceeded with the study. We started basically with the pre-feasibility studies. The pre-feasibility studies basically first identify of all the communities we were dealing with, which are listed here, all of them, 25 of them. We identify based on cost, different parameters, what would be the ones that would be 13 communities that would be selected for a feasibility study, for a pre-feasibility study. And the report, basically, you can find it here. I presume that you have access to these slides, and so you can have access to that report if you are interested on that work. And then using Homer, we identify, rank the communities based on different criteria, from different perspectives, minimizing cost, maximizing renewables, minimizing diesel use, etc. And in that case, we ended up with 5 communities. So we did different studies, different rankings using Homer Energy, and we proceeded with identifying the 5 communities. And these are the 5 communities we came up with. In Nunavut and 1 community in Northwestern Territories, which were identified these 6 communities for more detailed studies. Okay? Now, the next level was, well, we did a feasibility study with diesel generation, standard diesel generation, and then we had Innovus coming in with this particular device. This device, which is basically a variable speed generator, you have a diesel generator here, diesel engine. You have basically a synchronous machine, a permanent magnet synchronous machine, which is, this structure would be very similar to a wind turbine, full converted wind turbine that are now very popular and very widely available now in those days. And then you have an inverter rectifier system that basically interfaces these, which allows these to have any speed, doesn't have to be a very particular speed, isolates the system, the generation system from the load. And in between, you can introduce either an energy storage system, or you can introduce also, which is what they're looking at, ultracapacitors as a form of energy storage. Okay? So that's basically the system. And this has, as I mentioned, advantages of larger loading. Typical generators load, typical diesel machines, those generators are able to load between 50 to 100%. This will go as low as 10%, which increases the range, and then they are more efficient. Okay? Besides the advantage of having this power bridge that allows you to have some energy storage capacity. Okay? We apply a feasibility framework to study this. So first identify the data, then model the input data and try to basically identify the resources you have available, solar, wind, etc. And then basically reduce the search space and then apply our optimization, long-term planning optimization model. Now, basically the work we looked at, or the methodology we looked at, it was based in different approaches. So we looked at basically no renewables as the base. You're planning for 25 years, or 20 years in this case, pardon me. 20 years where we look at basically cost only. And then obviously the impact on renewables and renewable energy penetration and environmental impacts. And we look at solar wind mix with batteries and without batteries. Okay? Different studies. We proceeded with that, basically develop an optimization model of the objective functions, the constraints, which are described here, shying away from equations in this case, but you can see this in the report that basically was produced. And then this was the input consideration. So basically we were focused on basically O&M costs from the point of view of capital and O&M costs, trying to minimize those costs. We're introducing renewables and with VSGs. Now, we had to consider a whole bunch of parameters that I described here: solar insolation, wind availability, demand, age of existing assets. Basically, the important thing to remember here is that you have to keep to the constraints set by the utility, which is you have to have certain amount of available generation, spinning reserves, etc., for the system to be basically reliable. And to some degree they're resilient. And we presented results for the model without the voltage source, the variable source generation, VSG, in this report that is described here, in which basically we consider all these different parameters of the load. So you have load, you have temperature, you have solar radiation, and you have basically wind speed for all this generation, for a 25-year span. 20-year span. And these are the results, which are hard to see, but anyway, basically the bottom line of this is that as you introduce these variable, so we basically did 3 studies, and maybe I should highlight that. So you have basically the baseline, and then the different aspects of it. With respect to the baseline, we introduce a variable speed generation with physics speed, the mix. So in other words, use the assets you have, and new generation will be replaced with this technology. Replace all the technology in the second year, starting from the second year, all variable speed generation, and then try to look at the comparisons of all of these cases. And as you can see, basically the bottom line here was the following, that in all of these cases, whether it's fixed speed generation, which was based for this comparison, whether it was VSG, mix, or only VSG, we were able to basically reduce the cost of operation, just O&M and investment costs, which you need to replace all diesel generators, and introduce significant amounts of renewable. And the bottom line of these, which is here, and is highlighted here, which is basically my last slide, which is VSG allows us to increase the amount of renewables and reduce the costs, interestingly enough. So, in other words, the more of this generation you have, the more renewables you are able to introduce in the system. In some cases, up to 90%, 90% penetration in terms of energy. Now, this is certainly a very promising approach. WWF is looking at actually introducing these type of renewables in two of these 5 communities. And they're looking at basically funding. Now, the bottom line of all of this is, from all of these studies and what I've done in the last 10 years on microgrids, is that technology for all these sort of energy needed communities is available, is widely available, whether it's in the Arctic or it's in the desert. They are available. Technologies are available out there and are economically affordable. The major concern in all of these is trying to address the question that Nigel was posing, is basically the technologies are there. That's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck in all of this work we have seen here, in other words, and in other regions of the world, is capital cost. Who pays for this? Because even though in the long run you save money, you need an investment cost of several $1 million, right, at the beginning, or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Or in other words, you need some initial investment cost, you need some capital cost, and who is putting down that money? That's the major challenge that these communities are facing to introduce renewables in their system. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. We'll now move to Sandy MacArthur, and then we'll take questions after his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Can you hear me? So, good morning, everyone. I'm Sandy MacArthur, and I work for Jazza Energy. Unfortunately, I am not the founder, as Jatin introduced me. I was trained in physics and spent the last 5 years as an evil banker, so a little different background. But so Jazza Energy, we are a last mile energy company. We call ourselves operating in Tanzania. Let's pause. So the topic of today's discussion is, with respect to access to energy for everyone, is innovation the problem? So I'm just going to start by giving an overview of what is the energy access picture in sub-Saharan Africa. Nigel showed a picture, and obviously there is not that much light coming from Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Next, I'll tell you a little bit about what Jazza is doing and how we're going about the difficult problem of distributing energy to the last mile. And thirdly, I will tell you about some of the innovation that we've had to do, and what I see the problems to be that are really preventing further proliferation. So, as Nigel mentioned, SDG 7 is to give energy access to everyone on the planet by 2030. As of today, there's around 600 million people who do not have access to basic energy of any form. And there is a lot of money currently being spent on kerosene for in-house lighting and diesel generation for cell phone charging. That $15 billion number, it could be 25, it could be 10, it's not so important. The point is that people are spending a substantial amount of money for in-house lighting, which is less efficient, more expensive, and obviously toxic than a cleaner form of energy. So sort of taking a stock, and I'm taking some of this analysis, or most of this analysis, from a Shell Foundation report done in conjunction with a group called the Catalyst Advisors. They basically looked at where are we, what progress has been made with respect to SDG 7, and how much work needs to be done. Where are we going to end up? So by 2030, factoring in grid extension, population growth, there's 210 million households that will need to be connected in sub-Saharan Africa by whatever form that will be. If we continue with business as usual, we're going to miss by more than 100 million households. That is what their projections estimated. And that number, with business as usual, already factors in another $11 billion US dollar of investment into the space from today. In order to achieve, it looks like some of my points have been cut off at the bottom of my but in order to achieve SDG 7 by 2030, there's a lot of work needs to be done, but most notably, $35 billion of investment is needed. And this is just for sub-Saharan Africa. It does not deal with the rest of the world. The one point that has been cut off at the bottom here is that the task is particularly daunting given the fact that we've only connected 1% of households to date in sub-Saharan Africa. So a lot of work to do. So what are some of the challenges? I mean, affordability to the customer is a challenge, business models, how do we profitably sell? Because, I mean, my opinion, I'm not sure if it's shared, but you can't connect 1 billion people with philanthropy money. It's not going to work. There needs to be business models that build equity as they grow in order to deliver this service to a billion people. I think there's obviously a lack of capital that particularly local entrepreneurs in these communities have access to
we talk about family and friends rounds, but when you live in a village in Tanzania, you're not building a business with family and friends money. In some cases, culture is a challenge. Do communities want businesses to come in and provide energy? It's easy for us to sit here and say, this is a great product, but communicating it and educating customers such they actually understand what the value add to their life can be is, it's non-trivial. So that's speaking to the education awareness, policy environment, which Nigel spoke to, in some cases, a lot of the bureaucratic, some of the governments can be very bureaucratic and difficult to deal with, and as a small business operating in Tanzania, it is difficult. So, as Jadon mentioned, our founder, not myself, he has been living in Tanzania for over a decade. He started a tree planting organization on an island called Pemba, which is facing some issues with erosion as a result of deforestation. Started a tree planting organization, turned into a group that was working to really improve the productivity of local farmers with better farming techniques, et cetera. So he was and has been very well integrated with a number of communities in the country. And I think it was a few years ago, one of the women he knows there came up to him and said, "Jeff, thanks for the trees, but how do I charge my cell phone?" She was traveling 2 hours by boat to get to a diesel generator to charge her phone, and clearly there's got to be a better way to do this. So hence the energy hub. So what we do at Jazza Energy, and speaking a little bit to what Hassan was saying, with the sharing economy, we build energy hubs. So we go into community, we physically build a structure, we put about 1 kilowatt of PV on the roof. Customers, so we hire local people to build them, we hire local women to run these hubs. Customers purchase lighting kits and charging kits, so they buy a kit, they take it home, they wire their home. When they buy that kit, they get the right to use a battery. That battery, they bring it home, they plug it in. When it runs out, generally lasts about a week, depending on how much energy they're using, how much lighting they're using. When the battery runs out, they bring it back, they pay a small fee, and they swap it for a fully charged battery. So what we've designed is the hardware that manages all the charging, as well as acts as a point-of-sale system. So we have remote data collection in real time on who our customers are, how much they're transacting, doing inventory management at the hub, doing technical monitoring of the hub, what amount of energy is being generated, what's in the batteries. So to overview, we are a energy utility connecting one village at a time. We hire local women in community to manage our hubs. We sell the customer's devices, so there is a product we sell, and then there's an ongoing service we sell in the form of charging batteries. So our business model came to be based on the understanding that the customers who we're selling to are in many cases living on $1 a day, in some cases less. So affordability was the number one concern. How do we get energy into their homes for minimal cost? It's not about what's the per kilowatt hour cost, because connection costs are greater than their spend will ever be over their lifetime. So affordability was the main concern, and that's why we went with this centralized model. The intelligence of the business and the generation all happens in the hub. You don't need GPS on a product that's sold into the field. That increases the costs. A challenge we've had is, when we first started, we were building hubs and expecting that, okay, there's now this building in our community, people are going to show up and buy it. But when you go from kerosene to electricity, it's a pretty abstract concept. And we've had to, and we've learned this the hard way, that you actually need to spend a lot of energy educating customers, making sure that they're aware of what are the benefits of light as opposed to burning kerosene or any other fossil fuel. Some other challenges we've had, and I'm taking this perhaps a little bit semantically, innovation, I think we mean in the technology sense, but the innovation that's required is in how we tackle these problems in different ways. How do the business models evolve? How do the investors, how do capital markets evolve such that we can tackle this problem? We're building buildings in remote communities in Tanzania. Quality control was a huge issue. So we had to be creative in how we went about managing that process. We had to be creative about how we started talking to communities. How do we make introductions? Who's the key influencer in community that we need to build a relationship with? It's a common question and concern of potential investors and people generally is, you're building these things in Tanzania, aren't they just going to get broken in and robbed? I mean, in some cases, in some parts of the continent, the country, that may be the case. I mean, fortunately, we've not had any issues with security, but you can design for that. If you understand that that's a consideration, both around the hub building we're building and the batteries. If you're designing batteries with intelligent battery management systems to prevent tampering and prevent use on any other products, you can at least alleviate some of those concerns. So I think that where technological innovation comes in is with respect to efficiencies and affordability. How can we make products? The DC appliance market is a great point. We've got PVs, pretty easy to distribute. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's sunny. Let's get appliances that are easy to use because, why is energy important? Energy is not just important so we can turn on lights. Energy is important for, this building was built with energy. Education happens with energy. Everything is based on energy. And just building out the infrastructure to generate energy and to distribute it locally, it doesn't do anything if there's nothing to use it. No one's going to buy a television if there's no media to use. No one's going to want to buy insurance when they don't own any assets. So how can we, and I think this is where the real innovation needs to happen, is how do small SMEs and investors build partnerships that make profitable but holistic development possible in community. So I've gone probably a bit more quickly than expected. Yeah, I think I'm done.
Thank you, Sandy, for actually a very inspiring talk, because if I may reflect just for a moment, a few years ago when I was going all around Europe talking about affordable energy for humanity, and a gentleman in the audience raised a question to which I didn't have an answer, or a good answer, reasonable answer. And he said, how can you actually ever make a business go if your customers are living on $1 a day or $2 a day, the extremely poor people in the world? Give me an argument for a business case that and I fumbled my way through that particular answer. But you have provided an illustration which says, yes, it's technological innovations, you need the basic gadgets, but the social innovation and business model innovations are also just as key in being able to see your way through to creating a business that's sustainable. And subsequently, I have learned that, in fact, the $2 a day person, the proverbially poor $2 a day person, when he or she has that small quanta of access to energy, soon becomes a $5 a day person, and that's your emerging global market that we need to be able to think in terms of the kinds of services that we'll be able to bring. Leaving that perspective aside, now we look forward to questions for our panelists, and we have some time to entertain your thoughts and perspectives and comments. I see somebody standing up, so thank you. Please come on up to the microphone and your question, please, to either all of the panelists, or you might have identified one or two whom you'd like to respond. Please, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank all the panelists for the interesting talks. So my question pertains to the talk gave by Bisan. I would like to probably delve a little bit more into the allocation problem that you interestingly mentioned. I would like to know that the clustering technique that you used, probably what features of the homes you were using that guarantee that it could be more optimal than having one single aggregated storage, because it looks like to me that having one giant storage might be a better option than having multiple storage allocated, in different clusters. So I would like to know how you address that problem. Did you compare it with an optimization problem, actual allocation optimization problem, or just you use your clustering technique basically? And then it sort of also pertains that how large was the geographical area you were addressing for your allocation problem, and also if that was sort of reflected in your final optimization problem as well, or it was just one aggregated storage.
Thank you.
I can discuss further details with you offline, but just to give you a big picture of what have we been doing in that area. So the clustering will just tell you the demand patterns in terms of customers who have similar energy profiles, and this is taken from the data that's given from the Dublin. It's 5,000 households. So I would say it resembles a couple of communities, not just a single one. And in terms of the clustering that we have used, we've taken into account some attributes of the households, like income, like the number of people living in that household, the type of devices that they use, and so on. And this is all available in the data that we have. Now, in terms of, once we have the clustering, in terms of aggregation, so we definitely saw that having an aggregated storage device is better than allocating each household a single battery. So the allocation and the aggregation of storages provide us with a better cost and better distribution in terms of the energy. And that is coming out of the optimization problem itself. And once we have that allocation, then we have another optimization problem coming into effect to control the power consumption operations. And that's the scheduling component.
Okay, I understand that. Just one more quick question. I want to know the rationale behind going for the clustering technique. Instead of going with a conventional optimization problem for allocation?
So this was inspired by, to be fair, to ensure fairness, because we don't want households that are heavy consumers to be coupled with households that are economic, because they might be discharging a lot from the battery, whereas the economic consumer might be charging. So we wanted to ensure fairness between the customers who are sharing this storage device, and to ensure fairness, we decided to go with the demand pattern.
So the owners would be the households, or who would own the energy storage?
Well, that's something we didn't think about at this point, but I would say it should be the community who's kind of put the investment, and that's a good question. We don't know in terms of the capital cost, who's going to pay for that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Is there a question here? Yes, David?
Thank you. Is this on? Thank you. I enjoyed all of your presentations, and I was particularly excited with the connection between Nigel's and Sandy's presentation. Nigel, you talked about how providing energy to some developing countries enables them to start businesses and have some income generation. And Sandy, you pointed out, and Jatine corroborated, that it's perhaps a grossly underestimated market pursuing those that are poor currently, and they have the greatest potential for growth in their own lives, in their own communities, and to participate in international markets. So my question to you is, are you working with some of the microloan and economic development organizations that are working in developing countries that are right here in Waterloo Region?
Son, not in Waterloo Region. We're partnered with the largest microfinance institution or savings group in Tanzania. We're trying to do more of our business development in country, but the more the merrier.
Let's talk afterwards.
Absolutely.
Nigel, happy to hear any additional comments.
Yeah, I would just say that microloans and small-scale finance has been an absolutely critical enabler to being able to sell solar systems off-grid in sub-Saharan Africa and East Africa in particular. You're talking about, selling a $200 system to somebody who is not going to have accumulated $200 at any point, right? And so the ability to do mobile money and, small-scale finance where the customer can pay, a few dollars every couple of weeks or whatever it is, and gradually over time pay off the system is necessary to sell this equipment to these markets in a lot of cases. And the other thing that's really exciting about this is that when you think about some of these customers, this is the first time that they have any record of them purchasing something. They're able to enter the economic mainstream. I can walk into a bank later and say, hey, look, here's my solar system that I paid off. Here's a history of all of the payments that I made on time. I'd like a loan so that I can upgrade my farming equipment now. Thank you very much, right? And so it's just a critical part of this whole equation is small-scale finance.
And it's amazing what a microloan of $100 to $200 has done in the past. Particularly, you mentioned that, the loans are often given to women in the developing countries and what they're able to turn around and provide for in their communities. Yeah. So those $1 a day or $2 a day people, they borrow the $100 to $200 microloan, and it profoundly changes their life, their livelihood, ability to participate in a growing local economy, and a great track record of paying them back, as I understand.
Yeah, the repayment rates, a lot of people, when this was starting to happen more and more, and especially in East Africa, which was where the real trailblazers were, there was a lot of feeling that people wouldn't be paying back. How are they going to pay back? But the repayment histories are remarkable.
Great work, all of you. Thank you.
Yeah. One thing I would add to that is just credit is something that we understand quite well, and here in North America. Equally important to credit is the ability to save. In some cases, at a few of our hubs, we've actually become effectively deposit-taking institutions by accident because people don't want to have all the money on them because their brother might come and ask them for it or something like that. There are cultural reasons for that, but equally important to access to credit is access to savings. And what we're talking about with transaction histories is credit infrastructure. So like that, World Bank's super interested in that, and all of, IFC. But building out the ability and the infrastructure on which we can loan and have real ownership of assets, savings included, is really important and can be catalytic.
This is a truly optimistic perspective in that we're saying it's a hand up rather than a hand me down, moving away from philanthropy as the basis for trying to solve some of these problems, to be able to say you're taking the poorest, most disadvantaged individual citizen of the world, giving them a hand somehow to get out of that misery, and then they are now becoming bankable, credit-worthy customers that can get on with their lives. To break that logjam is really where these small, medium-sized enterprises like Sandy's are beginning to play a role and actually changing the equation of how we get to sustainable energy for all.